The Inspire Us podcast.
One was what you said at the beginning, that we've been in this very peaceful post-World War II situation. And I would definitely say it's easy for us to say that sitting here in London with the blue skies outside, people sitting in the park as I walked over here. But for many people out there, this hasn't been a long period of uninterrupted peace. And I'm not just talking outside Europe, but even on our own European continent, whether looking at the Balkans, whether looking at the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, whether looking at places where there are frozen conflicts, such as Transnistria, the breakaway region of Moldova, but also in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which actually broke out into full-blown conflict not very long ago. Once again, we see that there are constantly risks of tensions and political struggles that might ferment into conflict, especially when you've got a neighbor that does not seem to care about territorial integrity of its neighbors. So that's the first thing I would say, is it's not been a long uninterrupted peace everywhere. And then I would say, on to your question then, how do states try to navigate this? And there's a real mix. And what I always start by telling my students when we say I'm an expert on small states is, I'll turn it back to you first. If I told you, what is a small state, and how many do you think are out there?
So I was actually going to ask you that, because when you say small state, you don't mean in size, you mean like the capacity of the government, because perhaps you could call England a small state or the UK a small state, but it's a very big government with a lot of capability. But so what do you mean?
Yeah. So I think it's important we talk about this first, because it frames the rest of the conversation. So historically, the way we talked about small states is that we would look at the very material things like population and territory. And this is because most societies were agrarian, right? You need people to work your land, and you need people in your armies to go and conquer other places and grow your territory. But over time, we've seen that there have been many more states that entered the international system, process of decolonization, the dissolution of the USSR, and these other processes mean there are many more states. And also, it's no longer as socially acceptable for most states to just go and invade others. And so there's been a bit of a reformulation about, well, what does it mean to be small? And so I would say it's two things. It is still your relative shares of territory population, because those at scale affect how well the economy functions. It affects who you can trade with. It affects how your public administration functions. So domestically, those things still matter. And the way that the UK administration, which is not a small state, functions is going to be very different to that of Fiji, right? You might have one person doing a job in Finland where you have a whole team in the UK. So these things do matter. But then in foreign policy, it's very much about asymmetry. We can say sometimes Ukraine is small vis-a-vis Russia, or Taiwan is small vis-a-vis China. But then the way these populations function economically and in their public administration will not be small, because they are not small states. So it's kind of a combination of the two.
Okay.
And this is why at the UN you've got the Forum of Small States, which has 108 countries that are members. And they say it's states that have populations of 10 million or less. But then you also have states like Cuba and others that are outliers. They have bigger populations, but they say they conform to many of these challenges of scale, of small economies, small public administration shared by others. So I always tell people I'm not an expert on 108 countries, so please don't ask me something very niche on Bhutan or something like that. But I do understand the way the pressures of scale, which is the challenge shared by small states, what that means for their foreign policy choices. Because if you've got small states like Fiji and Paraguay and Lesotho and Oman, these are all so different geographies, different histories, different governments. Why do we then talk about small states as an analytical group? Because they share those pressures of scale. And that's our starting point. In Austria, which is a neutral country, you have the International Atomic Energy Agency, because it's neutral. In Switzerland, you have the UN in Geneva, because it's neutral. But then in Turkmenistan, which is the country that has gone to the UN and said, we want a World Day of Neutrality, for them, it's really so that they have non-interference into what their human rights situation is over there. So it can be used
can be
positive
weaponized.
effect to do what we call seek status, but it can also be used as a way of trying to refuse interventions of others. So that's one approach, which is to stay out completely. Then that also depends on your history, your geography, right? The Belgian experience of World War I and then Finland's experience in World War II, they show us neutrality works insofar as others agree to recognize it. And we've actually seen the huge news in the last couple of years after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when Sweden and Finland decided to forego the neutrality that has been long standing for them to join NATO, because they said the risk calculus changed. For other states, you mentioned the EU and the deals going on at the moment to move towards more common European defense policy. This is raising big questions for places like Malta, Austria, Ireland that are still constitutionally neutral and saying we won't get involved in military expeditions. So what's going to happen for European unity on defense issues unless some of these questions can be resolved? So that's one big one. Then, depending on your geography, of course, not everyone has that luxury. So places like the Baltics choose what we call the shelter seeking through these organizations like NATO that can help them have the umbrella protection of something like Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, and a seat at the decision table. So before Sweden and Finland joined, they followed many of the same provisions of NATO. They took part in peacekeeping operations. Sweden even got involved in the air war over Libya, but they didn't have Article 5 protection and they didn't have a seat at the table. So you gain those things when you become part of collective defense. Then you have to give up a little bit of your sovereignty. That's so important. So these are two examples among many that I can give you of some of the strategies that these states pursue.
Okay, so say if they were in NATO, do they lose control of like when their troops have to participate in conflicts? Is that what happens?
I wouldn't say lose control because you're still part of a collective, but you take a decision to say, well, we're going to be part of a group. We have to operate together. We have to take decisions in tandem. There is always still national sovereignty, but you still have to abide by the rules of the group. So even thinking of the European Union, you can't just say, I want to be part of the club, I'm going to join. There's what's called the Copenhagen criteria, right? You have to like tick these boxes and then maybe we'll let you join. And so there are rules that states need to abide by to be part of these organizations, and the same extends into the military domain. So I'll give you an example where we can see how states abide by, but don't always have the capacity to shape, is with the NATO 2030 agenda. So this is this strategic document that sets out the plans for NATO member states and where they see security threats and what the goals are. And I do quite a bit of work on Estonia, and I work with the Estonian Defense Forces. And their strategists whilst they fed in their opinions, weren't involved in the drafting of the document. So they take and implement what these documents say, but they're not necessarily always, even once they're in the club, having the capacity to contribute people to actually shaping the doctrine that is then carried out. And that is one of the challenges that come with scale. I mean, a lot of what I talk about with small states is their innovation, their entrepreneurship, but there are challenges that are quite obvious in terms of capacity. And you can see again with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, it's not like you say, okay, now we're in the club, that's awesome. You also have to say, now we need to have people in all of these different roles and covering all of these functions and developing all of these kinds of skills.
Did they end up joining NATO?
Who?
Sweden and
Finland, yeah, of course.
so they're in NATO?
They're in.
When was NATO actually formed? Do you know? NATO?
In the post-war.
Like what year?
I don't know the year off the top of my head.
Because I was wondering, what are the actual like guidelines?
That's a good pub quiz question.
Yeah, it would be. But so, for example, I think the UK, they participated with the US in the war in Korea, but they sort of opted out from getting involved in Vietnam. So, like, when do they have to abide by the rule? When is it imperative or mandatory that you have to comply or you have to cooperate?
So,
And when do you what is the level of
so
autonomy?
invoking Article 5 is when we mean an attack on one is an attack on one. That's only been invoked once, which was after 9/11, which is also what meant that everybody sort of came together around the war in Iraq. France wanted to activate it after the attack on the Bataclan, which you might remember, the terrorist attack in the concert hall that killed a lot of people. I don't think it quite went down that route, also because the threat wasn't as clearly who's the enemy to then go and attack. But it's on quite rare occasion that it would go to that extreme. But that is one of the challenges that currently persist around whether or not Ukraine will ever be allowed to join NATO, even if there are all of these statements that that's the future, because an attack on Ukraine would mean attack on everybody else. And as you mentioned earlier, you said the word nuclear, which is always the elephant in the room, that this is an issue that could bring nuclear powers into direct confrontation. At the moment, it's a confrontation. Even though we say we are at war, it's still being carried out in a third state. So a lot of the British population actually doesn't feel like we're at war at the moment.
Well, I guess in perspective, we're not at war, right? If you ask Ukrainians if we're at war, they'll say, no, we're not at war. We're not in the trenches. But I wanted to ask, while we're talking about NATO and these agreements, on the first look, it would seem that it's a small state's advantage to be part of a defense agreement, and that it would be, I guess, from that point of view, that a disadvantage, or as in like it's the small states are winning by being part of these bigger agreements. Do you think that first view is entirely correct? Is there another way to look at it? What's in it for the bigger guys?
Sure. The answer to everything in social sciences is it depends.
Yeah.
Of course, collective security disproportionately benefits smaller states, right? It means you gain access to a seat at the decision-making table. Technically, it levels the playing field a bit more. And I always describe the rules of international norms and organizations a bit like that scene in Gulliver's Travels. You know this book,
I've
famous
heard
book.
of it, haven't seen it.
So it's a famous book. It's a satire. And this character, Gulliver, goes on an adventure. And at one point, he falls asleep on an island and he wakes up and these tiny people, the Lilliputians, have tied him to the ground. He can't get up. And I always use this as a metaphor in my classes to talk about how rules and norms can bind the behavior of larger states. And so if you can get the things that benefit you into international law, that can serve small states better than a free-for-all where everybody's just doing whatever they want. And so Michael Barnett, who's quite a famous scholar of international relations, had said that world orders are created and sustained not only by great power preferences, not just what they want to do, but by what constitutes a legitimate international order. So we're sitting at the table because it's the established norm and you need the microphones here, but otherwise we could be doing handstands, but it's not really the norm to do that, right? And none of us said at the beginning of this, we're not going to do handstands, but we just sort of knew we would sit down on the chairs and not on the floor. So it disproportionately does benefit small states, but what's in it for larger states then? Well, in terms of shaping the order, it's quite beneficial to be able to be in the club and bring others with you than try to impose your will from the outside. I mean, some states will go ahead and try and do it anyway, but there are consequences. I mean, Russia's attack on Ukraine, whether or not we think the consequences have gone far enough, there have been sanctions, there have been impacts on trade, tourism, international reputation, all of these kinds of things. So even forcing a state to think twice or to have to consider those effects is, again, still better than an anarchic system. So there are benefits from them. The second is there can be learning that goes both ways. We talk quite a lot about what the small can get from the big guy, but actually there is so much that can be learned in turn. And that's also because small states tend to develop their niches. They say, we're not going to try and be the best at everything, but we're going to identify particular areas of real strength. So in Estonia, a few years ago, there was something called the Bronze Soldier incident where they tried to move a World War war memorial statue of a Russian general, and then suddenly got hit with a massive cyber attack, which is attributed to operatives in Russia. And they said, and it shut down a lot of major services and so on. And so as a result, they said, we need to be better prepared in future. And there was huge investment into developing cyber capabilities and responses against hybrid threats. And the NATO Center of Excellence for Cyber is located in Estonia. But you also have the NATO Center of Excellence for Hybrid Threats in Finland. The NATO Center for Excellence for Strategic Communication is in Latvia. So you have these centers of real deep expertise that the larger state can also learn from in turn. And the small places tend to be these sort of labs of innovation and incubators that can have solutions that can be scaled up. So there are benefits there too. And of course, when it comes to voting in a bloc, even if you're one pretty big country, you still often need to get the votes of others. So there are those benefits too. So working collectively can also serve benefit for larger states as well.
But the cyber point that you make is an interesting one, because there's a lot more to defense than just army and territory. And in that sense, it's never maybe in the mind of a small state to think about taking more land just because maybe they don't have the power to do that. Maybe that's the game of the big dogs like America, Russia, China. So what's in a small state's mind when they're thinking about defense in the 21st century?
Sure. Well, I think it starts at whether or not we're starting from the assumption that states would want to necessarily grow their territory, which is not necessarily a thing that all states are thinking about. Most states are actually thinking about how do I provide for growth and development and support my population as it is, rather than thinking about how can I go and conquer somewhere else. And also in terms of security and defense, again, it depends on where you're looking at, because I do a lot of work on small island developing states in the Caribbean and the Pacific. I was out in Fiji and last year in Barbados earlier this year. And for them, when you talk about security, the first thing they're thinking often isn't the Russians on my border. It's the
climate change.
Exactly. You knew exactly where I was coming with this. Is a slow onset threat of climate change and rising sea levels. And a lot of the current geopolitical conflicts are actually a distraction and pulling people back and away from the real problem. And this was the same issue when we saw something like the COVID-19 pandemic. Many small island developing states at the time were the winners. They didn't have a single case. But all of this plastic, single use, and so on was setting back again the climate agenda. And so at the height of the COVID pandemic, there was something called the Placencia Ambition Forum that was held by small island developing states, specifically saying we need to think about climate change as while we are doing our pandemic response, and came up with all of these recommendations. And we see this from time and time again, that even as there is geopolitical conflict, they're trying to sound the alarm that, okay, but we should also be thinking about climate. And this is where a lot of my work in the defense space is actually around this nexus of defense and climate. Because when you think about it, for context, the Ministry of Defense in the US emits more than all of Portugal. And the Ministry of Defense in the UK emits more than all of Malta. So at what point do these institutions that are meant to be protecting us and safeguarding us become themselves adversarial? And now you're never going to have, climate activists would say, well, we need to just dismantle the entire business of defense. That is not going to happen. And defense will say, well, a lot of climate matters, but the most important thing is that we're operationally resilient and effective and so on. And these two conversations are happening in completely different rooms. And the question then therefore needs to be, well, how can we show defense that if you are not thinking about climate, you will be less operationally effective, less resilient? And so try to bring these considerations more into the business of defense as well. Otherwise, we're just going to keep throwing stones at the windows and then nothing actually changes. So how do you get inside the house and actually move the walls? That is the bigger question at the moment.
But that's a tough thing to do, especially when it's the small states that are suffering, the ones that don't have power, that have to convince the big dogs to not use their weapons. And so let me ask you, what does a country like Fiji do when everyone's talking about they're going to be underwater in 2050.
Yeah.
It seems that even if they cut their emissions off, the problem is out of their control.
Yeah.
How do they approach this problem?
I think a perfect example I can give you is actually Tuvalu, because Tuvalu is the country in the world that is most likely to sink the first.
Tuvalu?
Tuvalu.
Oh, okay. I've never heard of it.
There we go. Everyone
Wow.
learned something today. Yeah. So it's very close to Australia. It's close. And they're expected to be underwater. And they've done a few interesting things. The first one is bringing international attention to your situation. So there was a very famous scene where diplomats from Tuvalu developed their intervention at, I can't remember if it was COP or at the UN, but the minister
they
was
did an interview
standing
in water.
waist deep in water, and he said up to a few years ago, this is where our land was, and all the headlines were there, and it brought greater attention. Second is, it's not enough to have attention. You also need to change those laws and those norms that I said bind people. And so there has been a landmark treaty this week at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, where small and developing states have gone to the International Court of Justice and said, we need to have a declaration about the responsibility of states to deliver on their climate obligations, and it's just passed. And this means it's not a recommendation, like states will be breaking international law if they don't deliver on those commitments. So you try and change the laws. The third is you speak to and meet larger players where their interests are. So Tuvalu is going to need to relocate some of its citizens and has signed an agreement with Australia. But this at the same time is also signing a big defense agreement so that Australia and Tuvalu will cooperate increasingly in defense matters. So you know that as there are concerns around what's going on in the Indo-Pacific, now this means that Australia also can cooperate and use Tuvalu essentially in some ways as a base for the things that it's trying to do. So there are trade-offs in everything, right? So that's another thing you try and think, okay, how do you speak the language of the things they care about? One of the big problems, for example, that climate change brings about is sea level rise. And why is this a problem? Not only because...
Can you push that mic a little bit forward so it stays in front of you?
Yeah. That's because I'm excited. I'm leaning forward. When sea level rises, it's not just that you lose some land. It's if this table is my house and I live here, it's habitable. Let's say seawater rises and this table's underwater, and now I'm living on this chair. This is uninhabitable now. This becomes a rock. And so this is no longer my territorial waters. Territorial waters start from habitable land. So I'm losing control of my maritime zone. This is the space where I'm entitled to the resources, to the fishing, and so on. And so small states have gone to the UN and asked for permanent exclusive economic zones. They said, we want to map exactly where our islands are now, and forever these will be our waters, no matter what. And part of the arguments used for that is saying, if we don't do that, then China will come into these waters, then others will come in, because you have to speak the language sometimes that you think others will be invested in.
Okay. So do you think the climate crisis is going to be the start of loads of these small states losing their autonomy, perhaps?
I think it's a mix. I think it's been a sight of them really having greater autonomy. If you follow something called the Bridgetown Agenda coming out of Barbados, led by Mia Mottley, that has been pushing for a complete overhaul of the way our international financial architecture works, the way we think about debt, the way we think about supporting states. I'll give you an example. We think that development works in quite a linear way, right? You're the development scholars. So we're saying, you're like least developing, you get some of your fisheries and tourism, and you're going along in this nice line. But as I'm sure you're aware, I always say it's a bit more like snakes and ladders. If a cyclone hits, suddenly you slide back down that snake, and then you're diverting the money that was supposed to be for this development back to recovery, back to adaptation, back to these different things. And so our international system isn't set up to reflect this. Many small and developing states are considered medium or high income. So they don't get access to that concessional finance that they need to be able to progress. And so the idea of the Bridgetown Agenda is recognizing these kinds of things. It's saying after a hurricane, we need debt suspension. how can we be paying back debt, if we're trying to also have the very basis of functioning society? It's saying we don't just need handouts. We can have things like debt for climate swaps, which says you forgive this amount of debt for us, and we'll spend it on adapting to the climate problems that you caused, right? So it's a swap. It's not saying just give us the money. It's saying forgive this, and we'll use it to make up for the problem you caused. And so there are many of these kinds of initiatives underway that have really shown the agency of small states and that have put them really in the driver's seat at negotiations. I do think it's a challenge with the kind of world leaders we've got at the moment and the direction the world is going in. But I think we're talking a lot about the state level. I mean, the elephant in the room. I'm trying not to say like the transactionalism of President Trump. But what gives me hope, who doesn't really believe in climate or doesn't care, but what gives me hope is that when he was first in office, you had in places like New York, Michael Bloomberg, who was mayor, said, we are still going to meet all our climate ambitions. And so it's about thinking about, it's not only what is being done on the national level, but what is being done at the municipal level, at the local level, and by every single citizen as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, this climate change and defense aspects, when you think about it, of how much they're actually intertwined. Because thinking about it, even, for example, in the Horn of Africa, climate change is causing a lot of drought, which is causing displacement. If a country, because of climate change, all of a sudden, all of their agriculture falls down, or all of a sudden their water source is not there, then all of a sudden that might be reason for them to start a war to go conquer more land.
And there's a saying that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And we could see that in Darfur. In Darfur, there was conflict over access to water. It's already happening. Where? Darfur.
Is that Sudan?
No, it's Darfur region. It's fine.
Oh, God, no, sorry. You're so good with your geography.
It's okay. It's, in Africa.
Okay.
But yeah, so there's already conflict over water, and we're likely to see these kinds of things spreading and continuing. And yet, one of the projects I'm working on with some colleagues is thinking about this issue of climate mobility, where might climate induce migration? And actually, the integrated review, the last kind of national security strategy, we can call it, for the UK, did sort of recognize these two can have an impact on each other. This didn't really feature at all in the latest national security strategy, even though that document was full of concerns about migration, right? It was all small boats. It was very much because of, the competition they're trying to pull votes away from. But yet connecting these dots they don't really seem to be connecting them. And in fact, I also searched for the word refugee in the latest national security strategy. It's not in there. And
climate refugees is a real thing.
Exactly. Then growing risk of it. And not only internationally, I mean, even domestically, we're going to see within our countries, like communities having to move because of rising tides, because of other kinds of risks, because of agriculture. And so it's not just something that's going to be happening overseas in Fiji or in Africa, but it's likely to be happening in other places as well. Fiji, just to point earlier, like Fiji actually isn't as much at risk of being underwater. That's why I went to the Tuvalu case. But it's because of the way the land is. It's much larger than some of the other islands. Actually, when I went there, I told them Fiji is 56 times bigger than Malta. So I was quite impressed by that. It was much bigger than I expected. But it's Kiribati has atolls. It's the low-lying islands that have a problem. But Kiribati has actually purchased some land in Fiji initially to be able for agriculture, to be able to grow food and so on. But with this sort of underlying premise that they might need to relocate some people there. And that's quite interesting because you're seeing other small island states becoming shelter providers for their neighbors as well. But it's not just a case of having physical security, which is a lot of what we're talking about. You have to also remember what that does to your identity. If you feel like your home, your place of being, your entire future might be taken away from you. And if you move, then obviously there are integration issues. But what that does to what we call the ontological security or security of your identity, if you are that vulnerable and that at risk that you might have to move. And that's a heavy burden. And there used to be a big campaign within these kinds of communities on migration with dignity. So developing the kinds of skills to be able to move and be productive members of societies in the places you come to. But there's also been a bit of pushback against that, saying actually that feels almost fatalistic, like we're agreeing to leave. So while there is emphasis on skills, if that does become an outcome, there's a big push on stay and fight and try to do everything we can to not have that kind of future. And at the moment, the reason why a lot of this is in my mind at the moment, I'm writing a book with a colleague for a series called Flashpoints, and we're writing the book on climate change, and it's due in September, so I've been working on it all day. But the idea of this book is where might climate change create these kind of flashpoints and tension points in the future, but we're trying to turn it around. And I'm asking, where can these kinds of junctures also create what I'm calling convergence points? Where can we see, okay, we've got this problem, but if we don't take this path, if we take this path instead and put in place different kinds of solutions, we could have very different outcome. Because the challenge with working on things that have existential dread, like climate change, like a lot of defense issues, like following the news at the moment on Ukraine, on Gaza, and all of these places, is that it can make you very negative or fatalistic. And I think it's very important throughout to try and have that hope as an intentional choice and try to think, and not just tell people, we hope things will get better, but how do we get there? What are some pathways and possible solutions? And I think that's what these small island developing states that don't just give up and say, we're going to sing, they continue to fight, they keep coming up with new mechanisms. That teaches us a lot about what we can do in our own societies for the problems we face as well.
But it's a tricky one because it feels like on one hand, climate change and defense can bring the whole world together. But on the other hand, it feels like, once countries start getting hungry and this and that, it's like everyone for themselves. It feels like it could either make or break.
But that's also where democracy matters, right? And the kinds of pressures that citizens and individuals need to bring about. And again, then speaking of hope, I've just come back from a week of teaching at summer school on climate change in Berlin to bachelor students that we run every year through this consortium called Circle U. And I always arrive at a point in the term where I'm a little bit burnt out and I've been following the news a lot because we have to, stay up to date. And then I get there.
It's tiring though, following the news all the time.
But you get there and there are these students who really want to work in climate sustainability industries, who are willing to give up a week of their summer when they could be on a beach to be in Berlin, which was raining the entire week, to actually learn about these things. And I think it always comes back to us and what we do as citizens as well. I mean, the school strikes for climate literally just started with Greta Thunberg standing outside her school, and it snowballed from there.
Is this ongoing? Is this current?
So this was a few years ago. So do you know Greta Thunberg?
No, I do know her, but
so she did, but the reason she's famous now, the way she started was she was very watching the news, learning about climate change, and got very concerned about it and went on strike outside her school. And then other students joined her and then others joined. And so I just think it's quite an important story of the pressures and the responsibilities we have as citizens and individuals too, because if we put it all on our national leaders, it can make us question, what can I do? But many of these leaders, not all of them, are in democratic societies and still do have to answer to their populations. So we do what we can, right? It's not just it's in the ballot, it's in the emails to our MPs, it's in the research and the work that we do ourselves every day as well.
Yeah, because I guess it's so challenging when you look at the larger global world, and there's this turn away from climate goals, and you have Trump in office. And I was actually listening to Ed Miliband say, because people were complaining and criticizing him, why are we heading towards net zero when we have the highest electricity costs in the world? And he very fervently defended it and just emphasized, it's important that we take action, that we drive this, that we lead this. And I guess it does boil down to your own individual actions. I know that's on a state level,
but it's also about showing the win-wins. I think that was the point I tried to make before. Like now, sustainability jobs outnumber jobs in fossil fuels. So it's not that we have to choose the sustainable way. We're not going to have the economy, and that's also the speech that Prime Minister Keir Starmer gave his Victory Day address in May at our London Defence Conference at King's College London, and he was talking about the defence dividend. So the idea that actually we're not like spending on defense also will create jobs, bring revenue to parts of the country
Industry,
that can benefit from that. I mean, just outside of London, you have commuter towns like Stevenage that have really benefited from having defense companies that are based there and having that industry. And so, just like I was saying earlier, we can't say, okay, we're going to have climate but no defense, which is never going to happen, and we're going to have defense and no climate, which shouldn't happen. We have to try and see how we can speak the language of seeing where we can develop these sort of win-win approaches.
Okay. Where do you think Malta is going? Do you think it's, in the middle of all this anarchy, let's call it, or just chaos? Do you think they're wanting to go more towards the EU and be part of the NATO? And
so Malta is an EU member state.
Okay.
It's been there since the early 2000s, but it's not a NATO member state because it's constitutionally neutral, but it's so it's not going to get involved in military alliances like NATO, but it is part of the European bloc. This is also where it's quite useful to separate between neutral and non-aligned. So non-aligned are countries that are not part of a particular bloc. So like at the height of the Cold War, India was non-aligned. It wasn't with the USSR and it wasn't with the US, but it waged 3 wars with Pakistan in that period, so it wasn't neutral. Malta is aligned with the European bloc and European values and democracy and so on, but it is a neutral country, so it doesn't get involved in military operations in other countries. The perfect example is the Libya crisis. So when that broke out about a decade ago, you had the British and the French sending in air operations saying we're going to get militarily involved. Malta said we are not going to do that, but it became the hub for all the humanitarian relief efforts to Libya. So taking out the wounded, sending in medicine, sending in water, all of these kinds of things which are so important and which were accepted precisely because Malta is a neutral country. And so I always say that shows it was neutral, but it wasn't neutralized. It still had an extremely important role to play in international security that was not underpinned by a military intervention. And so I see Malta continuing to play this kind of important role. So the Prime Minister has announced that in September, Malta, which has been for many years the UN rapporteur on Palestine and was head president of the UN Security Council, had the UN Security Council presidency last year in February and actually allowed the Ukrainians to speak and so on, in this September is going to officially recognize the Palestinian state, for example. So it's about, I think we're going to increasingly see these states trying to continue to push diplomatically, because that's what they always say, we're militarily neutral because we want to see diplomatic solutions to problems. So it doesn't mean it's a hiding strategy, we're going to stay out of everything. It means actively trying to pursue peace through different kinds of means. Sometimes that can be challenging. So not only is Malta part of the EU, but actually the president of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, is Maltese. And she's in a very difficult position at the moment because of the conflict in Palestine around what the role of the European Union should be there. And it is raising very big questions for Europe, which stands for sort of values and human rights and so on, about how to navigate what is happening there and how to secure a release of the Israeli hostages, whilst also bring about a ceasefire and an end to the conflict in a peaceful way. So it's a very complicated situation. And so diplomats, I don't envy the diplomats at the moment. It's easier for us as the academics to sit back and say what everybody should be doing. But I think the point I would make there is that ultimately I'm trying to say that for the neutral states, it's not saying out of things, it's seeing how they can be active and useful in different ways.
How does it change when we think about states that are governed kind of by terrorist organizations? And how do they think about defense? When you look at maybe now Afghanistan run by the Taliban, but even before that, less structured things. In Syria and Iraq, you have these terrorist organizations, or even now looking at Palestine, people look at Hamas being the defense of Gaza. So how do you look at defense with smaller states with terrorism in the area?
Yeah. I mean, I don't work on non-state actors or the Middle East, so I don't want to say something where I'm going to dig myself into a hole of ignorance. But I would say there's really good work on this area in the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London. So colleagues of mine like Dr. Shiraz Maher and Dr. Alexander Hitchens, they do a lot of work on these kinds of questions. So I would signpost people to go and see their work. But I think what I would say is that challenges like terrorism certainly still pose problems for a state that has a small scale to respond to them. So if I think of Singapore, about 2 decades ago, its entire national security strategy was all about responding to terrorism. What can be done? There can be efforts to increase national unity. So something that's really interesting in the case of both Singapore and Israel is they've got conscription not only as a way to defend these states from perceived threats, but also in the case of, for example, Singapore, they've got a large Chinese majority, they've got different minorities. It's a very mixed ethnic society. And so after independence, they needed a military not only to protect against threats that might come from Indonesia or Malaysia, which are their neighbors, and Malaysia controls their water supply, but also as a means of saying this will give people a sense of national unity. So that's one way of doing things. And there are a lot of political reasons for grievances that fuel terrorist attacks, but there are often also social grievances and people feeling disenfranchised and feeling let down by the state. If you look at the Boston Marathon bomber in the US, that was a case where this guy really felt let down by the social systems around him. Or if you're just more of a fan of popular culture, I think actually the first Joker movie was a really good example of where social services, where you can see mental health support and all of that really came to fail the individual. And so I think having structures in place to support societal integration and well-being and a feeling of being part of something in the state can be helpful approaches that we've seen states adopt too. And then, of course, the political questions are much more thorny and complicated to try and address.
One thing I've talked about with Dara is the influence that America has had over defense internationally. And America has had this thing, especially after, World War II, where they almost have said to countries, hey, don't worry about your army. We got you. Don't worry. That was it for Europe. Europe has, since Russia, they've kind of been, hey, America, you guys got us. With Korea, I think that, they did that with a lot of people, I think. And then now that Trump kind of came in, he's kind of switching it up and saying, hey, it's actually not our job to defend you smaller states. You guys need to deal with it. What do you think is the effect of that switch, and what also is the effect of America being this overarching protector of smaller states?
Yeah, good questions. I wouldn't say that the US has always said like, don't worry, just chill, guys, we got this. I think there has always been a call within NATO for all member states to pay their fair share of GDP. It's just been less of a priority when there are many, there's only so much in the bucket, and there have been other competing priorities that states were looking to invest in. And certainly, as you say, that now the first Trump administration, also the invasion of Ukraine, and the second administration have all really brought up these questions of what we call European strategic autonomy. So Europe really being able to look after itself. But it's not something that recent. As far back as Obama, he was talking about the pivot to Asia, and there was always sort of an eye on what China was doing as the competitor. And so this has been coming for a long time. Even if there wasn't the conflict in Ukraine, I think we would still have been seeing a withdrawal of some of the the energy and attention of the US because they are looking elsewhere. I think that the invasion of Ukraine has galvanized the support, the necessity to up that investment. It's also increased the fear for many states that they might be next. Although again, we're seeing this difference between states in different places. And it's not always been the case. The Baltics have always really invested and been really keen to make sure they are contributing and call on others, to be spending. We see a difference if you look more towards the west of the Mediterranean, where the threat perception might be less acute. So I would say at the moment, we're definitely seeing an increase. I don't think it's a bad thing for states to be able to say we can stand a bit more on our own 2 feet. But I would also say that there are big question marks that come, like if Trump would ever leave NATO, what would that mean for the nuclear umbrella? What would the UK and the US also are part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement, which NATO benefits from too. So there would be knock-on effects. One of the interesting things about your last part of your question, where you said sort of what are the effects of this. So I've spent, like I said, quite a bit of time in the Baltics, and I'm just always surprised they don't do even more together, more cooperation on certain defense issues. And they have the Baltic Defense College where they do some education together, and they are interoperable in many ways. But I'm always wondering, why don't they do more? And from my understanding, it's because they are all looking to the US as the partner to cooperate with and the shelter provider and so on, rather than each other. And sometimes they compete a little bit with each other, and there's a little bit of rivalry. And so I think that's quite an interesting dynamic. And I do wonder whether with some stepping back by the US, whether that might actually generate new kinds of deeper partnerships in other places, maybe Nordic and Baltic, maybe. We're seeing a massive deepening of the relationship between the UK and Poland in the last couple of years. So again, I'm a glass half full person, and my bottle's still mostly full. So I always try and think, where can maybe some of the positives come out of this?
What about in places like Africa, where there's not a clear hegemon and there's not even great levels of economic cooperation, and the infrastructure isn't there, and the defense capabilities aren't great? So in that context, could they gain from more cooperation, and how would they do it? And what is the discussion or focus in places like that?
Sure. I mean, Africa is an enormous and diverse continent, which is, over 50 countries. And so we shouldn't generalize either. I think even there are particular areas of expertise to learn from. So Botswana has real expertise in anti-poaching. Rwanda is...
Do you consider anti-poaching like defense?
I would, because
I would too.
Yeah, I have a concern with environmental security, and
I think there needs to be sorry to cut you off, a broadening of what we consider to be defense.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's related to other things, right? Poaching tends to be related to organized crime, which then tends to be linked to militia groups. So certainly. But you also have, very well-resourced, at least better resourced places like, Kenya and others that are working on trying to fight terrorism with Boko Haram and so on. So there's an experience there. So I just want to push back a little bit on the
generalization.
The generalization of Africa as being necessarily sort of weaker or so on, but where I'm always coming and say, I really don't think that Europe is thinking strategically enough about its relationship with Africa. I think many European powers, well, I say this about the UK, and I've said it in written things, so I guess I can say it. I think the UK doesn't have a coherent Africa strategy. I think it has an anti-PRC in China, the government, anti-Russian strategy, and then everyone else kind of maybe fits in insofar as they speak to that. I mean, there's some attention to Nigeria and Kenya as the big boy is in the area, and where there's historical relationships through the Commonwealth, but otherwise there's not enough engagement. And they say very clearly in the strategic documents in the UK, like our focus is on Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And so that and strategists in government will say it's because, we can't do everything. We have to have a focus. But actually, where is the largest growing populations in the world? Where is the largest future economic capacity going to be? And also on that's the positive side, but also on the threat level. I mean, the Wagner group from Russia has been active in Africa. If we talk about competition, if China is there building infrastructure and offering alternatives, why not make deals with China? So if you're so concerned about China, why aren't you thinking about what's happening here? So there's kind of a lack of this systems thinking mindset where we should be thinking about joined up pieces of the puzzle rather than just these silos here and these silos here. So I definitely think there's more that can be done in thinking about security and defense cooperation with African countries. I'm not convinced it's necessarily going to happen. I mean, at last year, so I'm on the board of the London Defense Conference, and at this year's conference, there was one panel on Africa because it was on the student-led Future Leaders Day for young professionals and students that I was overseeing. And it was one session on that day because I was like, hey, I think this would be really important. And all the other days of engagement between academics and industry and so on, you'd be lucky. I mean, I should have had a bingo card to see whether Africa came up because I think it's the missing link. And yet, again, the government's concern is migration. And where are most migrants likely to be coming from? It's because of conflict and security problems, typically in the Middle East and North Africa regions. And yet we're not joining those kinds of dots either. So
it's like it's true that everything is connected, and when a country thinks about defense, it seems like they really need to see how pieces of the puzzle are connected, right? If there's, Somalia being disturbed by Al-Shabaab and people have to flee, well, to what extent now is that UK's defense problem?
I think it's so hard to distinguish between security and defense in many of these areas. I mean, I did have a conversation in Fiji with the UK's defense lead there, and I was trying to talk to her about climate change. Oh, that's not defense. And I was like, well, the problem is we're not talking about it in defense. So then the activities of defense exacerbate that kind of problem. But there is still a sense that defense is your tanks and your guns and so on. And in fact, so I recently accompanied Minister Doughty over to Poland to talk about with Minister Prada about some of the issues that are going to be part of this defense agreement that UK and Poland are signing this year. When I was invited by the Foreign Office, I immediately said, well, I don't work on Poland, and I'm really not going to be the person who's going to talk to you about tanks in Ukraine. I mean, there are other people. I said, what I can come and talk about is, the fact that as we think about these defense agreements, how do we think about the fact that this agreement will operate in a warming world? And how can we think about some of the other things I brought up around lawfare and strategic foresight, needing to think ahead about the future and these other things. So are you sure you want me? And I was like, my King's profile is pretty clear on what I do. And they're like, yes, we need at least someone saying something a little bit, different. And so I try in these spaces to say, well, is our narrow view of what defense is sufficient for the way the world has evolved and the way problems intersect with each other? And so if we're trying to have the systems thinking mindset, can we really say this is in the defense bucket and this isn't? The only time it is really needed is when you sit down with the Treasury and they say, well, we need to apportion buckets of funding to this ministry, this one, and this one. And therefore, we have to know what is defense and what is education and so on, because we need to know which bucket we're giving to who. But actually, that's why we promote on the MA National Security Studies that I run this whole of system approach to national security. We have to see how these things intersect. And the perfect example that we haven't talked about is the way that, as a result, Trump and then Starmer have all made these massive cuts to overseas development and aid, which I'm sure you've talked about on
Many
your
times.
courses many times. And at the same time as they're upping defense spending. And I think these two things should have been better thought about in parallel, because if you're upping the defenses but cutting the support to the things that treat the causes, are you really just trying to put a bucket? You're paying for more buckets under the tap, but you're opening the tap more.
That's a good point, because Trump talks a lot about how they're sending all these criminals and all these things that are affecting our security. But if those countries were doing better, maybe less would come. I don't know.
But I guess there's no appetite to even want to. Oh, sorry. To connect.
You're getting excited too.
But no, there's no appetite to want to connect the dots. All issues overseas just aren't our concern. And even prior to the Labour government being voted in, they were talking about upping defence spending. And then as soon as Trump came in, it just the dialogue around it just completely changed, and everyone's attitudes also followed that. And it's just such a shame, because these things really have impacts. But the narrative is that we're funding corruption, and this money goes to waste. But I mean, I wish people could see the use that this aid does give these.
Well, as
global
two
South
graduates in development, right? That's what you said you've studied. So it's now going to be your job to go and change that narrative and try to say, okay, we've come to have a conversation bringing together defense and security and development issues. How can we keep that going, and not saying, well, this is a development issue, it's not a defense issue? How do we bring these things together? And now as the graduates, that's going to be your job.
100%. Oh, we're going to do our part.
So someone hire these guys.
Oh, too sweet.
On that topic, what are your thoughts on the EU upping their spending and production on defense?
Look, I'm definitely not against defense spending. It's just where is the money going to come from? For a long time, we've had actually disinvestment in defense sector. We've seen facilities that are falling into disrepair. We've seen reductions to armed forces and kit and capability to a point where we do actually now need the right kind of investment. And as I said, it could lead to positive outcomes, right? This defense dividend that Starmer is hoping will come about. So, there could be positive turnaround. I'm not against it. It's just it's up to the sort of economists to think about, okay, well, how can we do this in a way that can bring about this defense dividend, that can have these positive repercussions for the economy, and that can enable, where's the money going to come from, in a way that is not just let's all cut our aid budgets to do this. And I don't really have an answer to where that money should come from, because I also think we need to, fix the NHS and
so many issues in this country.
And higher education and primary school education is in crisis and so on. So I wish I had all the answers right now. I'd probably be sitting in some swanky office and maybe not in this room right now, or I'd just be very stressed. But I think the point is trying to recognize the way these things are connected. So I don't have a good answer to that question. I think it does need to happen. We should be asking, how do we make that happen in a way that can create these win-wins?
And I want to ask, what are your thoughts on NATO? Specifically now, I think it's talked about a lot.
What are your thoughts on NATO?
No, I think it's an important conversation because it's talked about a lot now, especially with this Ukraine war. And I think it's a tricky conversation to have, because everyone says, well, it seems the conversation is that, NATO is very important. We need to protect ourselves. But I remember that NATO was created to protect from the USSR. And when the USSR fell, there was an opportunity to dismantle NATO. And it seems that keeping NATO, in a way, played a role in keeping Russia an enemy instead of maybe building collaboration. Now, a lot of things happened, but what would be your
Sure.
thoughts on that?
Sure. I think it's a convenient narrative for Russia to say, oh, it's because of NATO, but actually Russian actions for a long time show that it's not it's about its own, it's about what its own leaders consider is in their best interest. So, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, Georgia is not part of NATO. We've seen the crises that have been caused in Transnistria and a part of Moldova. We've seen the hybrid attacks, even if not outright attacks in Estonia and other countries, even the Skripal poisoning on UK soil itself. So it's a convenient narrative to say, oh, we're just.
My
Sorry.
mom's calling.
Oh.
Busy.
Oh no, apologize to your mom for me. It's a convenient narrative. At the end of the day, Russia has invaded the territory of another sovereign state, and that is pure and simple like a violation of its own international law. And Russia's own domestic circumstances mean that with stagnating economic situation, this also gives Putin an impetus to be in power, to stay. So, and to your other point, it's not just that throughout this period of time, we've had us in NATO, Putin over there. There have been fora to bring both sides together. So I spent a few years as Malta's youth ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And that is a forum from what they say is from Vancouver to Vladivostok, right? It goes from Canada to Russia. And so within that forum, where everything has to pass by consensus, there have been attempts to negotiate, to draw in, to bring Russia into the fold. And for some time, it was working, but at the end of the day, it isn't. And so Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. I was at the ministerial summit where in Basel of the OSCE, where John Kerry stood up and said, and admonished Russia for it. And Lavrov, who seems to live forever, the foreign minister, who's still foreign minister now, like got up and walked out. Like it's, and so I'm not sympathetic, because also when you're having a quarrel with some other people, you don't necessarily go and say, I'm going to beat that guy to death. There are ways of trying to sort things out. So no,
But
I'm
what
not that
about from
sympathetic.
the perspective of people say that NATO had this promise of not 1 inch east? They had like this thing, they won't expand NATO.
Yeah.
And then slowly there were some expansions. And then I guess on the Russian side, that's what they say is the...
Yeah, again, it's a convenient narrative. But actually the recruiter of the year for NATO has been Putin, like as a result of his actions.
Right.
Finland and Sweden, that I said were neutral for years and years and years and years, have said, actually, I think would be safer if we joined this club. And so there is this principle of deterrence, which says that, you try to deter conflict, and NATO is seen as a deterrence mechanism. And if you ask the Baltics, they will say if it wasn't for NATO, they would also have been invaded by Russia by now. And they feel extremely strongly that NATO has actually been a way of protecting and enabling them to stand firm on the border of a large and aggressive neighbor. And so for us, as on the outside, it can be, for some, the narrative might be a bit sympathetic with what the Russians are trying to spin it as. But at the end of the day, it's a narrative. Like they're there because they want to occupy Ukrainian territory, and not because NATO moved a little bit east.
But deterrence is definitely a big key thing in defense. Same thing when we're talking about nuclear.
Yeah.
So on that point, would you say that the stronger defense countries have, the more peaceful the world will be?
It's a tricky one, right? The principle of deterrence is saying that in the nuclear space, for instance, is saying, if I've got nukes and you've got nukes, the idea is you will not invade me because you don't want that risk. It's very difficult for us to ever know whether the alternative would hold, because whilst in a perfect world we'd get rid of all nuclear weapons, until the adversary does it, you're not going to do it. And even if you did do it, the knowledge of how to create them exists. So you're never fully guaranteed that the other side is going to get rid of them. So
And
I
you're
don't
not going to
think-
trust that they actually.
No, and so I don't think that that will ever happen. Although bringing this back to small states, something interesting that happened a few years ago is that small states banded together and signed something called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So you might have heard of the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. That one exists. Most countries have signed it, which says we've got these nukes for now. We're not going to get any more. We're not going to spread them around, and nobody else is allowed to have them. It's convenient for those who do. Now, small states have said we're going to have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which says we want to get rid of nukes. And most of the places that have signed this are places that were the sites of these tests. And I think this is a really interesting case where both can coexist at the same time. So in my very limited and very rare free time, I'm a big fan of poetry. And John Keats, the poet, you might have heard of him. He was also a King's alumnus. He has this concept in his letters of negative capability, which he says is the idea of keeping two opposing ideas in your mind and not just trying to resolve them. And I think we're always trying to, say it has to be this or this. And I think this is the perfect example where I think it's absolutely right that countries that have been the sites of these nuclear tests and that have a really strong aversion to great power politics and want to live peacefully say we need to prohibit nuclear weapons. At the same time as I do understand how, as a result of the fact that we do know how to create them, you cannot trust the adversary and so on. And that so for long as deterrence is, we believe in it, that needs to exist as well. And I think we can have both these things. But in life, everyone wants it to be one thing or another thing, and we struggle a bit with complexity.
Would you say a small state that gets a nuke is automatically not a small state anymore?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
That's why when you said, "Oh, is the UK a small state?" Nobody who ever says the UK is a small state, just to reassure all your readers who've been offended for the last hour, not readers, listeners, but the UK has nuclear power and a veto in the UN Security Council. It's
a big
still,
boy.
even if in capabilities and reach and impact, some might say it's very more towards a middle power. I think it's still, in many respects, it's a great power, if not the superpower. But I'm a bit skeptical of all these labels. But there's something to be said for the nuclear umbrella and the P5 veto in the UN Security Council. And also, the soft power of the Beatles and the Queen and all of that. So it lives on.
Yeah.
When you look at China and Taiwan, and maybe we can end on this, what questions do you ask? What do you look at when you look at that situation?
Sure. That's an interesting situation because neither of those are small states. So they're not countries that I really work on. But what is relevant is the idea of asymmetry there. So Taiwan is the weaker part of an asymmetrical relationship vis-a-vis China. And so a lot of the whilst a lot of the way, as I said at the beginning, its economy, its public administration, and so on functions won't be quite the same as small states. And you'll have to take my course to learn about those. In foreign policy, a lot of the decisions it takes will be very similar and are quite interesting. So the questions I ask are, how do they keep attention on their situation on the international agenda? How, like with semiconductor chips, which they know the rest of the world needs. So what is their niche that they know will give them some leverage? Which diplomats and other partners do they try to have relationships with to strengthen their position? They also have, as far as I'm aware, conscription. So what does that do for the physical capacity of the state, but also the identity of those within the state? And actually, having a threatening adversary is quite good for national unity. And we say one of the benefits for, again, Taiwan isn't a small state, but for smaller states is they often have higher social capital. So this means the resourcefulness of people to band together in a crisis.
Okay.
It doesn't mean everyone likes each other more. It doesn't mean we all get along. Actually, many small states are very polarized. A great example is the height of the COVID pandemic when Jacinda Ardern called New Zealand a team of 5 million, responding to the crisis. Or in Uruguay, people stayed home without an official lockdown because they didn't want to put their neighbors at risk. And they kept numbers extremely low compared to Brazil and Argentina next door. So I would question then in some of these cases, how are they developing social capital? So there are lots of, and where are they looking for support in both material terms, in terms of supply chains, material, and then also what strategies are they taking abroad to project influence? Because it's not for the core premise of my course is always just that small states don't just want to survive. They also want to thrive. They want to influence. They want to have, they want to succeed in the international system. So I guess a question I'd be asking there is, what does this look like in the Taiwanese context? But I wouldn't ask these questions because I don't work on China and Taiwan, but I follow it to the extent that you need to remain engaged with what's happening in the world. The question I would be asking is, okay, while everyone's talking about China and Taiwan, what about the other countries in the Pacific? What is out over the China and Taiwan situation? You have places like the Solomon Islands or others that used to recognize Taiwan, and then because China came and did some deals with them, now they don't recognize it anymore. You see, so how is the Taiwan issue being used as leverage by China or by other states to have opportunity in the things that they care about? So I'm more looking at the places that people aren't paying quite the same amount of attention to, even as we should also pay attention to what's going on in Taiwan.
I mean, 100%. That's what I think we find fascinating about your work, because when we talk about, or just in general, conversations, all the same. America, Russia, China, and how are they affecting...
Yeah, your homework tonight is you're going to go read the Wikipedia page of Tuvalu, and you're going to read the Wikipedia page of Darfur.
No, to be fair, I need Tuvalu. That's on him.
I do none of them.
And you're going to look up Darfur.
I'll look up probably everything else.
And you'll apologize to your mom. I don't want to be held responsible for students not calling their moms.
Yeah.
But Hillary, thank you so much.
An absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I always wonder, like, how do people get into these niche interests, like defense? I feel like biology, economics, school, but studying defense is such a unique.
But small states specifically.
Yeah.
Was it because you're Maltese?
Yeah, I think growing up in Malta and studying international relations, we were studying the US, China, and I was like, this is all very interesting, but none of this applies to me. And I mentioned at the beginning, 108 countries are in the Forum of Small States in the UN. That's the global majority.
Yeah.
And yet we spend most of our time studying and talking about the anomaly. Now, I'm not saying we should put, any courses on US or China in the bin. Obviously, they matter. Obviously, you need to look at the sharks in the aquarium. But what about the innovations of the plankton, of the other fish, the other things that you need in the ecosystem? If your entire course on the aquarium is only the shark, I think you're only getting a very small sense of what it means to exist in that ecosystem. Yeah. And then I did an intensive Erasmus back when because Malta was in the EU, so back when people could go and do Erasmus programs, although Keir Starmer said UK should be going back, I did an intensive program in Iceland on small state studies.
Wow.
And that really spun my interest. And so I've continued to stay in touch with colleagues there. And I went back a few years later to teach on that course. So It's been a nice full circle moment. But I think you'd be surprised at how interested people are to actually learn about the places that aren't always in the spotlight and aren't always getting that attention. And I like to share one of my absolute favorite quotes by Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, who had said, in the world where the big fish eat the small fish and the small fish eat the shrimp, Singapore will become a poisonous shrimp. And so that's the kind of innovation that I think is so interesting. So I started because I had a personal interest, because I wanted to know more about what a place like where I'm called home, can do. But I think as I've gone down this journey, it just gets more and more interesting, because with scale, they say it's the necessity is the mother of invention, and then you can find some very interesting things as well. And hey, when they call you to say, can you come help us in Fiji? It's not that hard to say yes. So there are some perks too.
Well, Hillary,
Yeah.
thank you so much. Thanks for talking to us.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
Cool.